Well, welcome everybody to the ACRL Instruction Sections' Inclusive Pedagogy Spring Webinar. The Inclusive Pedagogy Committee creates opportunities for instruction librarians to learn more about inclusive, anti-oppressive pedagogy and discuss how they can implement these teaching practices in their academic contexts. Every year we host a fall and a spring webinar. So I encourage you all to volunteer to be part of the committee if this is something that you are interested in. I'll put a link in the chat to the Instruction Sections' Inclusive Pedagogies Committee. So I'm the moderator for the webinar today. My name is Yen Tran, and I am the Scholarly Services Librarian at Seattle University. I'm also a member of the Inclusive Pedagogies Committee. So thank you so much to everybody for attending today. Today's webinar centers around a recent issue of, or a recent special issue of Reference Services Review. The special issue focuses on the integration of critical and inclusive pedagogical practices into library instruction and instructional aspects of library services. The chapters in the special issue discuss various dimensions and aspects of inclusivity in libraries, with special emphasis on reference, instruction, and research support in academic libraries, special collections, and archives. In the webinar today, we are joined by the co-editors and a few contributors of the special issue who will share their work and their experiences. So the agenda for today is to have all of the presenters give their presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. If you have any questions at any time, please feel free to use the Q&A that's down there. And then I'll be monitoring all of those for any questions that don't get answered. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the co-editors of the special issue.
Thank you so much, Jen. So my name is Dr. Mónica Colón-Aguirre, and I am a faculty member at the University of South Carolina, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to this ACRL webinar on the special issue of centered around inclusive pedagogies. So before I pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Kawanna Bride, who was also the co-editor of this special issue, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the context of what we're going to be doing today. So one of the first things I love doing in all of my classes is providing definitions, because definitions give us the groundwork from which we can part from an agreement of what we are talking about today. Inclusive pedagogies is a topic that comes to us, not surprisingly, from the education field. It has been defined as a pedagogical approach that responds to learner diversity in ways that avoid marginalization of some learners in the community of a classroom. And that definition is by Spratt and Florian. One of the things that we can and should be thinking about is the levels of marginalization through which potential learners and individuals in society can go through. So in many ways, this marginalization can take place based on any aspect, including social, emotional, cultural, racial, physical ability, and beyond. So another important thing about this special issue is that it's putting this topic into the context of libraries. Although it started in pedagogy, in the field of education, it has many applications, especially in our fields, in those especially that deal with lifelong learning and support of classroom activities. So now that I have provided this brief introduction, don't want to take too much time because we have great information coming up and a lot of presentations. So I'm going to pass it on to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Kawanna Bride, who will give us a little overview of what we're going to be the materials we're going to be presenting today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. Monica has provided basically the most important aspect of the work we had to do as co-editors. It was us trying to figure out what we were looking for in terms of the call and then reviewing the proposals that we received, that meant that we actually received a really fantastic variety of topics for our proposals. But that made our decision-making process even harder. There were so many good proposals, but we had limited space. We were told we couldn't publish them all. We wanted to, but we were told we couldn't do that. But what we really wanted to do was try to make sure that what we presented represented the gamut of possibilities for how we were seeing librarians really working to address this idea of inclusive pedagogies in libraries from a variety of perspectives and utilizing a variety of approaches. We really wanted to make sure that what you were going to see was going to be both representative of the concrete and the theoretical, that it wasn't all just going to be based on direct application to students or to even to faculty and staff, also the experiences of those who are engaging in that work, which we thought was really important. So what we have for you today are 3 fantastic examples of that type of work. You're going to be hearing about work that's going to challenge your idea about how we provide library services based on gender identity and biases that can negatively impact trans and non-binary populations. You're going to be hearing about the perspective of Black and Latina practitioners of color working in special collections, public services spaces. And you're also going to be hearing about a pair that wanted to introduce this idea of dramaturgy to us and how we could apply that as innovative pedagogical approach. So because you're here for them and not for us, we already had all the fun. We're going to shut up and we're going to let them speak up first. And I think first we have Tal, you're up first, correct? Perfect. All right.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Ness. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the linguistics librarian and a resident at the University of Michigan Library. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, awesome. Next slide, please. Throughout the presentation, I'll use the term cisgenderism, which is defined by Lennon and Missler as the cultural and systemic ideology that denies, denigrates, or pathologizes self-identified gender identities that do not align with assigned gender at birth, as well as resulting behavior, expression, and community. Next slide, please. In the article, I suggest that we must turn our gaze inwards and critically reflect on our practices and services to denaturalize some of these oppressive systems. In critically examining our practices, we can avoid what Sarah Ahmed refers to as tick box diversity, calling attention to institutionalized diversity or diversity practices that don't challenge larger power structures, and DEIA efforts that are done for the sake of self-preservation and are basically performative in nature. Next slide. The study discussed in the article aimed to assess the prevalence of bias and inclusion efforts in Illinois libraries by measuring across 4 constructs: self-reported bias attitudes, bias behaviors, use of individual inclusive practices, and knowledge of trans and non-binary user needs. And lastly, organizational inclusive practices. Then seeing if there is a relationship between the first 3 constructs and gender identity. I hypothesized that there would be a relationship and there would be a negative correlation. Next slide. Results from the study found that there was a significant negative correlation. Cisgender participants self-reported having more bias in implementing less inclusive practices and had less knowledge of trans and non-binary user needs. Although cis library workers reported having a stronger presence of bias attitudes and beliefs, the results suggest they are likely willing to alter their behaviors to become more inclusive and understanding of trans and non-binary user needs, and are likely willing to implement inclusive practices that further their understanding and acceptance of trans and gender diverse user communities. Next slide. I suggest the findings are positive because awareness of systemic problems make visible structures that can begin to be addressed, amended, and changed, whereas fundamentally shifting every actor's internalized biases and prejudice is a much more difficult problem to face. So the issue isn't necessarily what Dean Spade calls bad actors with obvious bad intentions, but rather behaviors that are biased, problematic, and uphold cisgenderism in libraries. The failure to perform basic inclusive practices further reinforces that practices are symbolic and do not demonstrate actionable inclusion efforts that are, as Wagner and Crawley suggest, critically in opposition to a system that actively works against marginalized persons. Next slide, please. A large percentage of participants reported that to some degree, they believe it's obvious when a man is a man and a woman is a woman, believe the male-female dichotomy is natural, would feel uncomfortable sharing a bathroom with someone identified as trans, assume pronouns, and do not utilize gender-neutral language. I believe several of these attitudes and behaviors can be altered through diversity training, with special attention on gender identity and presentation, and policies that protect trans and non-binary users and library workers. Next slide. The majority of participants reported they believe they both provide fair and equitable access to resources for all gender identities and provide equal services. However, it's difficult to understand how participants determine this when almost half, to some extent, do not understand the information needs of trans people may differ from cis people. Only around a third have participated in discussions on cis privilege and have attended professional development opportunities on trans and non-binary topics. Also, about 35% of participants indicated that to some extent, they do not initiate conversations about how their community, how their library can support trans people. If so many people have not had discussions about the role of privilege, if they have not attended professional development opportunities on topics that support trans and non-binary users, if they don't initiate conversations, how do they know if their version of allyship, their idea of fair and equitable access to services, actually reflects the needs of their trans and non-binary communities? Next slide. In analyzing questions from individual and organizational practices, the responses suggest that although the values of the profession seem to be recognized and accepted, actions and practices in realizing those values appear to be lacking. Almost a third of participants were unaware whether gender identity is in their non-discrimination policies. The number of respondents there was 252. If library workers are unaware of the details of their policies, they will be unaware of the expected behaviors they should adhere to and their rights in the workplace. Additionally, the data suggests that about 19% of participants do not, to some extent, agree that their organizations demonstrate a commitment to diversity, and many do not feel adequately trained for their work with trans communities, nor believe their colleagues are aware of trans user needs. If library workers don't feel trained, it seems that some organizations may not be focusing enough effort on providing their workers with the resources they need to work with diverse user communities. I also found it interesting that almost half of participants chose neither agree nor disagree when asked if their organizations make an active effort to interview trans candidates, and almost a quarter felt their organizations to some extent don't make this effort. A possible implication is that libraries are not actively demonstrating a safe and welcoming environment that attracts diverse people to these positions. Next slide, please. This study offers action items that can be implemented in any library type and a template for assessing prevalence of biased attitudes and behaviors and use of individual and organizational inclusive practices in libraries. I'll discuss several of these and drop a resource in the chat later on. Model inclusive behaviors. When you find reliable resources or engage in diversity training, learn inclusive practices, language, and behaviors that you can implement in your daily life and in your library, model those behaviors to your colleagues. The results suggest participants felt their colleagues were somewhat unaware of trans user needs. If your colleagues are not aware of those needs and you feel you are, help direct them to the same resources you learn from. Another finding revealed participants chose neither agree nor disagree when asked if they initiate conversations about how their library can support trans users. Reflect on how you can leverage your position to start discussions on ways your library can better support users. Be an ally to your trans and gender diverse colleagues. The findings indicated the existence of biased behaviors. If your colleagues at any point suggest they are being discriminated against by someone in your organization, including your supervisor, listen to them. Brushing away concerns or making excuses for others are microaggressions and can only make a coworker's already uncomfortable experience or confrontation worse. Henry suggests that when people who have been treated this way decide to speak up about it, if they're usually told to consider the intentions of the aggressor instead of the action, or to consider that maybe the issue isn't as bad as they think, or not significant to warrant corrective action. Worse, they may be told that the event didn't happen at all. The best course of action you can take is to believe your colleagues when they tell you they're being discriminated against. If you are present when something occurs, document it and offer to be a witness, and avoid downplaying the severity of the issue. Critically examine your organization's commitment to diversity. Many participants suggested that their organizations are committed to diversity. If you believe your organization is, determine why you have this belief. Commitments to diversity should not solely rely on accepting people regardless of differences. Policies must be put in place to create a safe and welcoming environment for trans patrons. Next slide, please. Thorogood et al. Advises that a failure to adopt trans-specific policies and practices can result in higher turnover, decreased engagement, and possible litigation. As Stephen J. Kruger puts it, you can't tell employees what to think or believe, but you can tell them how to behave at work. And you can do that with implementing policies. Policies should include instituting gender-neutral dress code, specific language regarding gender identity or expression as a protected category, updating personnel records to accurately reflect individuals' names and genders, providing comprehensive training, ensuring accessibility to gender-neutral restrooms, and implementing a policy that explicitly respects individuals' restroom choices, crafting a gender inclusion policy for organizational events, and not presuming assistance in creating this policy solely based on gender identity. Additionally, organizations should actively solicit concerns from their members rather than assuming they will be volunteered. Reach out and let people know that you would appreciate their input, but don't volunteer them to participate. Next slide, please. Participants are reporting not having the necessary tools to better serve their trans and gender diverse communities or for modeling behaviors to their coworkers. Organizations need to increase focus on providing resources and training, and that can't rely on grassroots efforts alone. There's a tendency in some libraries to make DEIA and social justice programming and education the responsibility of library workers who are not typically compensated for these efforts. So it relies on volunteer work, which leads to burnout for people passionate about this work, and it's unsustainable. Though library workers should have the option to opt into this work, the onus shouldn't be placed on individual library workers. Library admin also need to consider tangible markers that demonstrate active participation in challenging cisgenderism and thus meeting the standards of the profession in providing fair and equitable access. After training, your library workers should understand how it directly relates to their specific roles, including thinking of gender inclusion training as explaining why it is important, then instructing them how to put it into practice effectively within their workplace. I suggest as an alternative to or solely relying upon grassroots efforts, organizations should outsource LGBTQIA+ diversity training with special attention on gender identity and expression, starting with admin and management. This approach shifts the responsibility away from the overburdened library staff and ensures comprehensive and effective training. And then the resource I'm going to drop in the chat is a list of people who can give presentations, lead trainings, consult, or otherwise provide information on how libraries can be more inclusive of people of all gender identities. Thank you.
Thank you, Tal. So we will move on to our next presenters.
Hello, I'm going to. Can you see the screen yet? Hold on, let me see. Let me see. Okay, do you see slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay. Is it now full screen? Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Jasmine Sykes-Kunk.
My name is Azalea Camacho.
And my name is Sandy Enriquez.
We, the authors of Small Acts, are truly delighted to share with you today some insights about our collaborative writing process and the article that we produced from that work. But first, we wanted to start by thanking the co-editors, Dr. Kawanna M and Dr. Mónica Colón-Aguirre, for their support. For me, this was actually the first time that I published, and so there were a lot of questions that I had, that I also asked of my colleagues and my co-authors. So we also want to thank the Andrew Mellon Rare Book School Cultural Heritage Fellowship. The three of us were all recipients of said fellowship, and that is how we were even able to come together to know that we wanted to write about this. Just to give you a little overview, I'm going to talk about the article and its aims and our process and approach, and then each of my co-authors are going to share some of their insights as well. So the title of the article was inspired by a Caribbean idiom that Bob Marley and the Wailers made popular through their 1971 song. It's also the name of a peer-reviewed journal about diasporic Caribbean studies. And I wanted to just play like a quick snippet for you. And the lyrics on the screen. So I don't want to go too heavy on the analogies, but in the library and information profession, the lack of diversity, inclusivity, and belonging has persistently remained a major issue, despite decades of research, initiatives, joint letters and task force, and attempts to address these inequities. And in special collections public services spaces, such as classrooms and reading rooms, the disparities are even larger because some of those professional best practices and security protocols often reinforce systems that can be harmful and triggering, like checking bags and requiring identification and being monitored in the reading room. Uh-oh, wrong button. Let's see, can I switch? There we go. As Black and Latino women who lead in these spaces, we are acutely aware of these harms and are often doubly impacted because our management positions require us to uphold those very same structures that have caused us harm in both professional and personal lived experiences. But also being managers and recipients of this fellowship has given us the privilege of time to come together and write and think and vent. And we hope to bring more visibility to our work and its potentially significant direct impact with the community. Now, finding times we are not on desk or teaching that align across time zones was not easy. And I really wanted to also thank my co-authors for their patience and flexibility during our many long Zooms at random hours of the day and night. These conversations were really generative and productive, and they provided us a safe space to reveal the challenges that we uniquely faced as women of color in this work. I kind of truly really miss those calls, but I am glad that the article has been published and it's out in the world for you to read as well. We landed on a framework that encapsulated our diverse yet parallel perspectives in intersectional Nepantla, which combines Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality and Nepantla, which is the third stage of Gloria Anzaldua's 7 stages of conocimiento. Which is a seminal Chicana feminist theory framework. Intersectional Nepantla, as defined by Aaron Rampt, is an analytical lens that creates an internal/personal and external/societal system of examination that leads to the investigation of and resistance towards oppressions for women, particularly women of color. And that is a quote. Our lived experiences and internal frustrations with the oppressive structures are the seeds from which our small actions sprout. We offer our smaller actionable practices to mitigate some of these existing barriers and to help create a more inclusive space for our patrons and also for ourselves, bringing folding chairs for everybody, like the great late Shirley Chisholm. So I'm going to shift to talk about my work. The John Hay Library at Brown is also an Andrew Carnegie Library, which mandates that we're open to the public. While the majority of our reading room and classroom visitors are within the Brown community, we work hard to live up to our motto, which is the first thing on the wall that you see when you enter the building. And it's on the left of the slide. You belong here. For visitors who did not schedule an appointment or unable to return in the future, we keep facsimiles, some of the photos on the right, on hand to provide examples of the collections. When I first arrived, the only facsimiles available were from the H.P. Lovecraft papers, as they are most often and frequently requested, but they're also the most restricted given their fragility. It's also widely known that Lovecraft had held xenophobic beliefs. I felt that wasn't really representative of the depth and breadth of the Hayes collections, nor did it align with our recent demonstrated reparative efforts, every day trying to make everyone feel like they belong. And having to give this over to greet people and say, here's an example of us, which was the antithesis of who I am and what I thought. And this project was initiated by my colleagues, and the intent had always been to expand the facsimile collection. So I invited Hay staff, especially our student workers, to nominate materials they feel better represented the Hay in themselves. This process allows colleagues to share other aspects of their identities, which may not often be seen in their day-to-day work. And our newest addition is the facsimile on the left, which is a copy of the George Orwell's 1984 manuscript. We plan to add 10 to 15 new facsimiles every year. And this is one of many ways that I try to hold space for more voices and ideas. Thanks for your time. And I will now turn to Azalea so she can talk some more.
Thank you, Jasmine. So I'll go ahead and talk about my experience or my work at California State University, Los Angeles, which is a public university in East Los Angeles and is one of 23 campuses that form the California State University system. As a university among a rich history of immigrant communities, Special Collections and Archives aims to preserve the diverse lives and historical narratives reflected in our heavily first-generation student body and the major contributions their communities have made to the dynamic cultures of Southern California. At the heart of the department is a dedication to bringing awareness of the archival profession and special collections librarianship to our students and campus community. This dedication is inspired by my personal experience as a first-generation university student of immigrant parents from Mexico who instilled in me the importance of hard work and education. In the article, I reflect on my experiences navigating academia as an undergrad to working in an academic institution. I've had constant thoughts of how to navigate in the in-between of two worlds, the reality of the profession and my sense of self. Even though I'm in the constant struggle, I have learned to strategize in the reality of the academic setting to make space for my authentic self and others. Through this self-reflection and ongoing challenges within the profession have shaped the framework of the people-centered approach enacted in my daily interactions and practice. We could go on to the next slide now.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. So I began to chip away with my small actions in developing a Special Collections and Archives Student Assistant Program, which was established in 2015. The aim of the program is to expose students to the archival field by providing mentorship and hands-on training in processing, digitization, reference, instruction, programming, outreach, and curation. The program offers an opportunity for students to combine their lived experience and expertise with the skills they acquired through guidance, mentorship, and training in archival practice. A supportive work environment is created where students are encouraged to share their perspectives and participate in critical discussions. The constructivist learning theory allows students to solve problems in authentic and realistic situations. Moreover, they begin to build confidence and experience the direct impact of their contributions to the campus community. Through this program, I have been able to engage with students individually on an everyday basis and witness the gradual growth in their research skills and understanding of the inner workings of a Special Collections and Archives department in an academic setting. Former student assistants that have participated in the program's orientation have shared their experiences, tips with incoming students. One former student assistant commented that the program has allowed her to explore and play in developing creative projects using archival materials, which have enhanced her overall academic experience. Another student commented that Special Collections was her safe space. This student assistant or the student experience in this program has a long-lasting impact on the students' confidence and sense of belonging long after they've graduated Cal State LA. So this is just an aspect of how I contribute to the small actions. But I'll go ahead and now send it to Sandy.
Awesome. Thank you, Azalea, and hello, everybody. We can go to the next slide. So now I'll talk a little bit about my section of the article, and the lived experience that I talk about is actually my first encounter with archives and special collections as a patron. So by this time, I had already been working in special collections for about a year as a graduate student assistant during library school. But as an assignment, I had to visit a brand new archive repository as a patron. And so I was really excited about this. At the time, I was living in New York City, so I had amazing access to incredible repositories with vast collections. And I really wanted to find material that reflected my own community, being from the Andean diaspora. And since New York City is an area with a really high concentration of people from the Andean diaspora, oh, sorry, my lights can't turn off. There we go. I expected to find a lot more representation, and unfortunately, that didn't happen. I wasn't able to find any materials that directly related to my own community. And even my experience of navigating these special collections and archives as a patron versus as a worker, student worker, was vastly different. And so that experience overall inspired me to create this reading room analysis exercise that I do in some of my classes now that I'm a full-time librarian. And in this exercise, we talk about photos of different archival repositories across the US. And I start kind of broadly with just one main image, and I ask students to describe the image and kind of share what kind of feelings or emotions does this image evoke. And then as we go on through this series of images, we get to collages like you see in the second image here on the slide. And I ask them to kind of identify what are the elements that you see across these images. And so through these conversations, we're able to talk about these spaces and talk about these broader issues of inclusivity in a more approachable way. Next slide, please. And I wanted to share this quote from Samuelson and Coker that I talk about in the article, because I think it really exemplifies why it's important to sort of have these conversations and do these types of exercises with students. And in this quote, they talk about how we shouldn't assume that our practices and special collections will be automatically understood, but rather we need to take an anthropological stance on teaching, on instruction for special collections, and really examine how these practices have emerged and how they're still replicated in the space. So I think that my exercise really exemplifies this, because it's asking students not just to accept that our rules and protocols, but to examine our spaces critically, really look at the spatial arrangement, at the way that, you know, these desks are arranged, the type of furniture we have, all of those aspects, and investigate how these rules are replicated beyond just verbal instructions. And on the left-hand side here, you see another example of my slides, really thinking about the arrangement of the reading room as a whole. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll wrap it up for our presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And now we are on to our last presenters.
Hi all, just checking that you can see and hear us.
Awesome.
All right, thumbs up, great.
Thank you so much for inviting us for this opportunity today to present alongside some fantastic work that's being done by our colleagues. We really appreciate this opportunity. And thank you especially to Kawanna and Mónica for your support in getting this paper to the larger community. So thank you. My name is Sarah Brown. I'm a liaison librarian at the University of Waterloo. And joining me today is...
I'm Dr. Kari D. Weaver. I'm the Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Waterloo, and also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies of Education at the University of Toronto. So I have many hats and many titles, as several of my colleagues do.
We'd like to acknowledge today that the work presented occurred on the lands traditionally cared for by the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This and other efforts with inclusive pedagogies are part of our active work toward reconciliation.
And I'm going to talk briefly just about,
Sarah and Kari.
About the context of what dramaturgy is, but I wanted to just take a moment to situate us within what Sarah and I were collaborating on and how we approached this article.
Hi.
Our article, Drama Queens, is really
Sorry to interrupt, Sarah and Kari. We can't see yours. I mean, we can see your slides, but they're not advancing.
Oh, dear. Well, that's no good. Okay, let's try. How are we doing now?
We're not seeing it in full screen.
Okay, let's try a new share. There's always here. How about now?
No.
Yeah. All right. How about now?
Now you're good.
All right, victory. You never know with technology, right? All the different setups. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate your patience. So this article is a reflection on a practical lesson that Sarah delivered and I helped design. And we'll talk a little bit more about what happened, but really underpinning this work was the overall question of how can we implement an approach to inclusive pedagogy within the context of one-shot information literacy instruction. And that was really underpinning this work because it's a common challenge that we are certainly dealing with in our efforts at the University of Waterloo, and that is really very pervasive within the academic library profession as we're thinking about how to approach critical information literacy and inclusive pedagogy work. If we can't find effective ways to actually implement within the one shot, we're going to struggle to be able to advance these efforts. So we had an opportunity to collaborate on a project and actually try to implement something and see how it worked. And we decided to do that through implementing dramaturgy within, or a dramaturgical approach to instruction within a course. And you might be asking the question on the slide, what exactly is dramaturgy? So dramaturgy really comes out of theater and dance education, and it looks at how meaning is made and values constructed socially through performance. And it can certainly be used to examine identity and social relationship construction, which is particularly important if we think about ways of interrogating issues like the scholarly conversation or the value that we place on information as articulated by the ACRL framework that helps to guide a lot of the instruction that we do in the academic library context. So part of the argument that we are making in our paper is that dramaturgy in and of itself is in fact an inclusive pedagogy because it's not something that has received widespread consideration within the LAS literature. So a dramaturgical approach where you introduce some sort of performative element in the class aligns with active learning, and active learning approaches in general have been found to be more inclusive approaches to pedagogy than a traditional lecture-based approach, which is what we most commonly see in both information literacy instruction, but just generally in teaching within higher education. Because a performative element naturally places a lot of the learning and, in a sense, the instruction in the hands of the students, it actually changes the power dynamics within the classroom space, which again aligns with inclusive pedagogical approaches. And the active performance itself, pulling from the theory of dramaturgy, allows us to collectively construct meaning within the classroom space. And all of this really aligns quite well with the ACRL framework, but is something that, as I said, really hasn't received a lot of discussion or consideration within our field. So Sarah's going to talk about what we actually did, and then we'll address some of the takeaways that we had from that.
Thank you, Kari. Just gonna put this over here, if that's okay. Yeah, so what does that actually look like? At the time, I was the liaison librarian for a women's studies course, and was invited to speak to the class about bias within research. And so Kari and I met and discussed how we might approach that for a one-shot. And we decided to incorporate some dramaturgy in order to help the students kind of rethink how they might consider bias within their research in terms of what they find and how they find it. So in class, we started off right after introductions, splitting the class into two fairly large groups. I think there were about 10 to 12 in each group. And they were each provided with a skit prompt and asked to create a short 3-minute skit based on the prompt. So half of the class received a prompt that asked them to consider the fact that medical research around heart attacks has mainly focused on middle-aged white men. And so what does that, how does that research enact or perpetuate biases when it's being implemented or being used by researchers? And then we had another skit prompt that asked students to consider what the movie like Black Panther that was coming out at the time, why having a movie representation of diverse or marginalized groups, why that was so important to particular groups. And so surprisingly, because I wasn't totally sure how this would go along for a third year course. But surprisingly, all of the students really jumped in. They were eager to participate. There was enough space that if folks were a little bit more shy or less interested in taking the spotlight, they were able to kind of take on a less prominent role, but still able to contribute in kind of developing these scripts. And then following the skits, we were able to have a class discussion about content production and authority. And then the class was divided into even smaller groups to develop a self-bias inventory. And so what that looked like was similar to a CRAP test or a radar test, but it was developed by the students without necessarily prior knowledge of those tests, to consider how they would assess information that they received or the information that they are searching for. And so some of the key takeaways that we had from this was that the skits allowed an opportunity to further discuss bias in research, and it gave students something more tangible to consider when they were in these discussions, rather than coming in kind of talking about things theoretically and not really having any kind of grounding in how they can approach these discussions. Students were able to further identify themselves as active players because that element of being in a skit or in, involved in like a dramaturgy, allowed them to really put themselves into context. And we found that that really helped them to see themselves within then research and academia. They were willing participants, which was excellent, because if we tried this with our library colleagues at the university, I'm not sure that they would have been as willing to create skits in front of their colleagues, but we were really impressed by their willingness to participate. And following that, they were really primed for lively discussion. They were really interested and engaged in kind of digging in deeper. And we found that, the one shot can be limiting in terms of, not having enough time. However, this opportunity and introducing the dramaturgy, I think, really allowed us to get into those deeper conversations in a one shot that sometimes can be difficult to do. And we have some references, and I think now is time for general questions. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the presenters for presenting today. And now we are in the Q&A section. So I think there was a question in the chat about the number of respondents in your study, Tal.
There were 252 respondents.
Thank you. Any other questions for the presenters today?
Am I allowed to ask a question while we wait for others to post one?
Of course, of course.
And this comes from having, of course, in-depth knowledge of all the papers, but Tal, I was actually really interested in whether or not you were considering expanding your study, like running your study again outside of Illinois, because you got a lot of great number of responses for being in state, and just wondering if you were thinking about the possibility of encouraging others, including yourself, to maybe expand your study a little bit.
I would love to do that. I think I just need to work on some of the questions and work on the instrument just in its totality before I do that. But it would be nice if people from different states also do it, so I don't have to think of it on like a national scale, although that is what I wanted to do when I was in grad school. It was like, what if I just reach out to everyone? And my advisor was like, do not do that. You'll never finish your master's thesis. But yeah, I'd really like to.
Well, hopefully you get some people. Yeah, hopefully people will reach out to collaborate. That would be fantastic for you.
That'd be great.
There's a question for Kawanna and Mónica. What led you to publish this special issue?
I don't know if it led us to publish it. We were approached. I was approached originally with the idea and asked if I'd be interested in serving as an editor. And this is part of the work I do. This is the research I do. And I knew this was the research that Mónica did. We collaborate on a lot of stuff. And I just felt that we would do a decent job of bringing something forward that would be useful. And so even though we were both a little swamped at the time and all of us working 3 jobs, you all know what that's like. We felt that it was important to do. And then we also, you heard some of the presenters say that, we spent time with them as well. We felt we had a responsibility as well in that aspect of our work, was to support others in publishing this type of information and getting it out there. So so originally we have to give complete credit to the journal. This was actually their idea originally, and we just had the opportunity to run with it. Mónica, anything extra there?
Yeah, it's like Kawanna said, she was approached and then she's like, hey, Mónica. And I'm like, well, you know what I like, all I need is an invitation. And we are very passionate about the topic, so we really love the idea and highly recommend it if you have the opportunity in the future to be an editor. Bring in a friend. Kawanna and I tag team a lot, so it's kind of like one picks up where the other one leaves. So especially if you have that kind of friend you have that agreement with, highly recommend it. It's a lot of work, but it's extremely satisfying. So
Thank you. A few questions for Sarah and Kari. How does your study work for libraries that are smaller, if you've thought about that?
Well, I would say the disadvantage you have in a smaller institution is just that part of our collaboration is that we design the lesson together. Sarah was able to deliver and I was able to observe the lesson so that I could take notes and we could have more comprehensive reflection about both the process, but the outcomes and what we saw happening, because often when you're delivering the instruction or guiding and leading the instruction, it's really hard to have that perspective. So what I would say at a smaller institution is that there might be an opportunity to, say, collaborate with the disciplinary faculty member that you're working with to provide that sort of collaborative feedback and observation, as an alternative to having a library colleague be able to fill that role. And that may be an approach that would work more effectively in a smaller environment. But it also, I think, is one of those things when you're doing something new and you're not sure if it's going to work well, you need to have somebody that you feel comfortable with to fill that observer role. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree.
Talking about comfort level, there was a question about encouraging students to be more willing participants. The person who asked the question worries that the students they work with would be embarrassed.
Yeah, that is a tough one. I think part of that can be the relationship that you have with the instructor and knowing kind of what class you're going into. I feel like you can tell, usually if I'm going into a class, I can tell within the first couple of minutes if that class is used to participating or if they are used to sitting there and just being lectured at. And if they're used to sitting there and just being lectured at, then you've got a bit of a mountain to climb. It's not impossible, but it is going to be a bit more of a struggle. I think ways to do that, I think, are just, giving them enough right out of the gate so that they aren't really getting comfortable. They've just kind of sat down, is a really, and maybe even getting them to move around so that they can get together with their groups. I find that sometimes for whatever reason, once they start moving, they're a little bit more willing to participate in ways that they don't always, if they are already feeling like I'm sitting here and I don't really want to do anything further. But I don't know if you have other suggestions, Kari.
Spectacular failure.
Yes.
So one of the things in working with my colleagues, because part of my my particular role in this library is supporting liaison librarians like Sarah in incorporating like new and diverse approaches to education within their work. And the reality is not everything is going to work, and sometimes it will work sometimes and not others, and that has to do with the different composition of learners, the different learning environment, and so on and so forth. Don't be afraid to fail. I call it failing spectacularly, because the biggest threat, I think, to instruction within academic libraries is that people don't think about us, or we don't get noticed, or we don't get invited. And even if something didn't work quite the way that you wanted it to, or maybe not all of the students fully participated, although that wasn't our experience with this. You still are demonstrating that you are thinking about these issues, that you are trying new things, that you're able to be innovative, and try to engage with students in new ways. And I do think that our disciplinary faculty colleagues see and appreciate that, even in situations where maybe your go at that particular approach to information literacy instruction didn't happen quite as you had envisioned it. But I also think that's where the opportunity to collaborate with somebody for observation is maybe helpful, because that if it hadn't gone well for us, we would have I would have been able to say, you know, here was kind of the point where things seemed to go off the rails a little bit. So next time, how could we redesign this so that we could have a better approach going forward? So.
Great, thank you. There's a question for Jasmine and then a question for the panel. Jasmine, how are you gauging visitors' impressions of the newly available facsimiles? Do you survey visitors routinely?
The challenge for this group of visitors is that they're just walking in off the street. So we don't have a way to quantify and to capture it outside of the reporting feedback I get from the people on desk. We share desk responsibilities. So if you're in processing archivist, or if you're in special collections or digitization, so everybody does at least once a week a shift. And so we keep an ongoing chat. So if there are incidents that are negative, we always hear about them, and on also the other side. And that's kind of, I guess, the basis of our article. We're just throwing out the things that we wish we had when we were in those situations. Because at work, people, when are asked to talk to the manager and I come downstairs, most of the time they're surprised that I look the way that I do. I am not the face, we are not faces that people associate with special collections and rare books. So just in the hope that if everybody is contributing and everybody is putting a little bit of themselves, there will be things enough for a diversity of ideas and people, as well as a variety of materials available on hand. And to trust that over time, it will just be like, there's no way really to quantify, I feel, how someone belongs until you just keep making space and other people participate. So I'm sorry if that's not. Does that answer the question well?
I think so. Thank you. So we only have a couple minutes left and we do have a lot of questions, but there is one question for the panel that I would be interested in you all addressing. Do you have any recommendations for implementing inclusive practices in states that may be more hostile to these initiatives?
This is like the Jeopardy countdown where everyone's like, not me, don't look at me. I'm not answering this question. I'll throw out something for you. The beautiful thing about inclusivity is that it doesn't necessarily have to always tick the boxes that I call the trigger boxes. And we definitely know what the trigger boxes are. It can and it will, but you don't necessarily have to advertise that that's an aspect of the work you're doing to be inclusive in that work. Part of what you really are doing is just making sure that you're addressing the different approaches and styles and perspectives of all the people coming into that space, regardless of their differing identities or the intersectionality of their identities. And so typically what I will tell you to do is utilize the terminology that has been approved by your university. So like now we are all about belonging, people. We're going to belong, and that's it, and that's fine. They think that that's a bad word, but where I come from, that fits. That's what we do. That's the whole point of the work we do. Utilize their terminology when you're describing the work you're doing, but within your work, you pretty much are able to do what you need to do. You're able to address those needs. So for me, it's just don't advertise by using the trigger words, use their terminology and still continue doing your work underneath that umbrella. So that's my suggestion.
And if I
Okay.
can just add something like really quick, also work with your networks. You have networks to identify needs. Go to those organizations that exist sometimes outside of the institution to actually help you and that you can collaborate. And like Kawanna said, in many cases, these and policies have been passed. So this is policy now. So I'm in South Carolina. And we've been told most likely soon we cannot call it DEI. So we can call it something else. So I will call it something else. Remember the goal of your work. Forget what you call it. Call it whatever you want. Remember the goal. Keep your eye on the prize. And that's how we will get out of this. And these are waves, to be honest with you. There's like the ebbs and flows. So we're in the backwards ones. Like I expect the opposite to come. I have hope.
Well, we are out of time. I'd really like to give a huge thank you to all of the presenters and thank you to everybody who attended. I hope that you're taking away some useful tools to provide more inclusive classrooms and inclusive libraries. So thanks again to everybody for attending today. Hope you have a good rest of your day.